Welcome everyone to this first session in our webinar series on the topic of drug discovery and development. How do you get from an idea to a marketed drug? For those who join us for the first time today, I'd like to mention that this is a webinar series that is arranged by the Translational Research Office, which has been in place since 2019 to support researchers at the University of Oxford advancing their research towards the translational and commercial space. We do help a lot of our academics on grant applications and questions related to translational research, but we also occasionally arrange training sessions and webinars as well on chosen topics. We also have an entrepreneur and expert in resident schemes where we involved a lot of external parties in requests related to applications we see across the Translational Research Office. We have at the moment more than 30 experts who have joined the Experts in Residence scheme in the drug discovery and development phase, in the digital health space, in the regulatory space as well. We also have experts able to advise on commercial opportunities and how to develop innovations as well on the longer run. A lot of our experts have been helping teams with one-on-one meetings, training sessions such as the one today, and has been really helping designing kind of master classes and providing feedback for a lot of researchers looking for understanding the realities of translating the research ideas. Just an overview of the program for this webinar series. So today is the third session, and we'll be touching upon the topic of regulatory. We've been starting the series on the 20th of October, and we had a great introduction session also run by some of our entrepreneurs and experts in residence. Last week, we did discuss the topic of drug discovery with Dr. Steve Rice from AstraZeneca. Today, as I mentioned, we'll be touching the topic of regulatory in the drug development for drug development programs. Next week, we'll be discussing the topic of engaging with pharma with 3 speakers from academia, biotechs, and also pharma. Later on, we'll be talking about commercialization strategies and business cases for your research projects. And the last session in the last week of November will be on investment opportunities. So that's the overview of the program, and the webinars will be running until the end of November. So in today's sessions, we'll be welcoming Dr. Tom Oakley, who is a VP of Regulatory Affairs in the ProPharma Group. And Tom is also part of the Experts in Residence scheme at the University of Oxford, and is available to answer any of your questions regarding to regulatory and drug development projects. So without further ado, I will pass on the screen to Tom, and thanks again for taking the time to join us today.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction, Anne-Sophie, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. So as Anne-Sophie mentioned, I'm going to speak to you about drug development and regulatory affairs. I did actually do my PhD at Oxford many moons ago, before leaving the bench and getting into regulatory affairs. I work now at ProPharma Group. ProPharma Group is a life sciences consulting group. We help our clients with everything they need, from manufacturing consulting through medical information, pharmacovigilance, and of course regulatory affairs as well. And that includes both US, EU, and Great Britain as well, now that the UK has left the EU. So I head up the European Regulatory Development Group at ProPharma. We're a team of 45 consultants, and we help our clients with everything they need from a European regulatory perspective, which essentially is everything on this slide. For the purposes of today, though, and probably of most relevance to this audience, I'm going to focus what I'm going to tell you on the preclinical and phase 1 clinical stages of drug development. That being said, what I hope to persuade you of this morning is that there's a lot to be gained from engaging with regulators relatively early on in development, both in terms of de-risking and accelerating your activities, and also in terms of increasing asset value and profile of a medicinal product. What I do also want to talk to you about is the latter stages, the marketing authorization application. The main reason being that an MAA filing can be closer than you might imagine. It's not necessarily the case that you have to have a phase 3 study in order to get an MAA. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about a couple of situations where that might be an opportunity. So in terms of what I'm going to cover, so first of all, I'll talk about why you would want to engage with the regulators. I'll talk about who they are and what they do and how speaking to them can benefit your product. I'll talk about starting a phase 1 clinical trial, the type of data that's expected, the documents and procedures that you need to authorize a trial in human subjects. And then, as I mentioned, I'll talk about some regulatory incentives and expedited approval programs. So first of all, why engage with the regulators? There are many of them. So each country has its medicines regulator. The most obvious one for this audience and for today is the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, who are the UK medicines regulator. Likely you've heard of the FDA, the US regulator. There's also the European Medicines Agency, who conducts central evaluations of medicines and scientific advice for the European Union. But obviously, as I mentioned, every country has its own medicines regulator, including every country in Europe. So there's ANSM in France, and then BfArM and PI in Germany. In terms of what these agencies do, they fulfill a number of different functions throughout the development process. So the first thing they do is they approve. So if you want to get a clinical trial started, the agency responsible needs to grant a clinical trial authorization, whether that's first in human or beyond through to a pivotal trial. They also approve things like pediatric plans. So the pediatric investigation plan, which I'm not going to talk about in depth, but is a very important part of drug development in Europe. The PIP is an important thing that you need to get an approval for from a regulator. And then the last stage in the process is approving a license for the product, reviewing the marketing authorization application. And beyond the initial MAA filing, if there are any new indications, then the regulators will review those for benefit risk as well. The regulators also advise, so you can go and have a conversation with them before you file your CTA and get their advice on whether the package you're providing is sufficient or not. You can take national scientific advice on a range of different topics, and I'll talk more about that shortly. There's also, as I mentioned, the EMA, who provide central regulatory advice through the CHMP, the Committee for Human Medicinal Products, which is relevant to submissions for European Union marketing authorizations. And that's not only during the development phase, it's also post-approval for new indications as well. The regulators also incentivize. So there are a number of different schemes available, and I'll talk more about these in some depth, to help foster development of medicinal products. Those include things like orphan designations, ILAP and Prime, SME, so small or medium enterprise designation. And these things have value during the development phase and then also post-marketing as well, in terms of additional product exclusivity and rewards for completing things like pediatric plans. The regulators inspect, whether it's pharmacovigilance, manufacturing, or any other regulated process. They will come and inspect the activities to make sure that they are sufficiently compliant. And they monitor as well. They monitor particularly product safety. So the regulators get the SUSAR reports from clinical trials. They also get the DSURs, and they, in the post-marketing space, monitor pharmacovigilance through things like periodic safety update reports. And all of these things feed into the risk management plan, which is the overall view of the risks and mitigations that are necessary for a medicinal product. All that being said, one thing I do want to emphasize is that the regulator's prime concern is safety. And if you look at the MHRA website, you can see this in terms of the number of times the word safe or safety or risk proportionate appears on their website. There's a lot of activities the regulators undertake, but really safety is the thing that they are concerned about above all else. So one thing I want to get across to you is that thinking about regulatory, your regulatory strategy and bringing in regulatory thinking will help de-risk and accelerate your product development. And whether your initial objective is funding or whether it's longer term licensing, coming up with something called a target product profile, which I'll explain a bit more about shortly, coming up with a regulatory strategy, and then having a meeting with a regulatory agency to discuss these things and validate them and make sure that the assumptions that you've made and the requirements that you think you need to address are accurate will help de-risk and accelerate your pathway to funding or indeed licensing. And there's different ways to engage with the regulators. I've seen all these three approaches among the clients that we've supported over the years. There's the cautious and secretive approach, where sponsors only disclose what the agency asks for and otherwise keep their cards fairly close to their chest. There's the more confident or combative approach, where the sponsor is of the view that they need to educate the agency on the data and their product. And then what I would argue is the more productive approach. There's the open and collaborative approach, which is where the sponsor really has an open conversation with the agency and explains what they're trying to achieve and takes on board the advice and really takes the view that they're going to engage with the regulators to shape their development activities in collaboration. In terms of how the regulators can help you, there's three areas really I would emphasize. So first of all, there's scientific advice, and this can either be national or from the CHMP or the EMA. The regulators will provide advice for a fee on any aspect of the development of a new medicine and at any phase of development, and that includes prior to CTA submission. And this can be on topics like the choice of patient populations for clinical trials, the endpoint that you want to use, or indeed the comparator that you might intend to include in a clinical trial. They can also advise on the appropriate characterization of the medicinal product during manufacturing and also on broader CMC topics. They can give you advice on your non-clinical data and your strategy that you might be using to address potential safety concerns. And the statistic that is quoted by the EMA is that around 70% of medicines that are authorized receive scientific advice. There's a reasonable correlation between sponsors who take advice, follow the advice, and the eventual approval of a new medicine in patients. The regulators also foster innovation, so they can provide an orphan designation, which is something that exists to recognize the challenges of developing medicines for rare diseases. With an orphan designation comes reductions in fees for advice, longer term marketing exclusivity, and also this is something that raises the profile and asset value of a medicine as well. There are some new initiatives called ILAP and Prime, which I'll talk more about. These are opportunities for enhanced regulatory planning and advice, which again increase the profile and value of an asset. There's also the Innovation Task Force briefing meetings held by the EMA, and these are very early informal discussion meetings to help inform the development of a new medicine. Overall, though, the thing the regulators can help you do is reduce the risks, timelines, and costs associated with development. So understanding the regulators' requirements mean that you can address them sooner rather than later, and taking scientific advice is pivotal and increases asset value through reducing uncertainty. Engaging with the regulators helps you to avoid delays from having to respond to protracted questions, which might come, for example, during CTAs, or from having to do additional non-clinical or clinical studies to meet their requirements. And I guess ultimately medicines development can be competitive. So if there are delays that come about as a result of having to do additional or repeated studies, then that can mean that a window of opportunity closes and a medicine that might otherwise benefit patients doesn't ultimately reach licensing. So I'm also going to talk to you about how to start a phase 1 clinical trial. I guess before I get into that, one thing I wanted to talk about is the target product profile. And if you want to read more about this, there's quite a good paper that was published in Lancet HIV earlier this year. And this sets out a target product profile for an HIV cure. And it provides a useful example of what a TPP looks like and what it aims to achieve. So TPP is really the end objective of the development. So it sets out the minimum and optimum requirements for things like the target product, the target population, the clinical efficacy that you're going to try and demonstrate, the safety and tolerability that you're going to need, and many other components of the profile for the product as well. And arguably, and it's well worth investing some time in the TPP, because inevitably drug development is a multidisciplinary activity, and setting out the expectations and objectives early on will not only make sure that everybody's clear on the end objective, but it also makes sure that you're developing something that fulfills an unmet medical need and is of real benefit to patients in the long run. And there's multiple sources that are worth considering for your TPP, everything from guidelines that are published by EMA, FDA, ICH, or indeed clinical practice organizations, through to advice and consultation you can get from contract research organizations, clinical advisory panels, patient advocacy groups, or indeed consultancies like ProPharma Group, through to reviewing precedents from the literature and also the published regulatory assessments. One thing I think it's worth drawing your attention to is the European Public Assessment Reports, or EPARs, which the EMA publish on their websites. These are a detailed assessment of how the CHMP have evaluated new medicines, and it's a very insightful summary of the data that's been presented and the regulators' view of it. So I'd recommend that you read some of these if there are medicines that have already been licensed in the space that you're interested in. And then, of course, as I've said, it's well worth meeting the regulators, and most often that's through scientific advice, but there are avenues such as the Innovation Task Force that are available to you as well to help you shape your target product profile. In terms of the data that's expected to open a study, from a CMC perspective, you need clinical trial material that's GMP compliant and released by a qualified person. You need data from at least 3 batches that are representative of the manufacturing process that you're using. You need to follow the European Pharmacopoeia and the EMA guidance that's available. You need to show stability data for storage, transportation, and in use. You also need to show traceability of source materials and your reagents. Any animal-derived excipients need to have TSE certification, and you need to be compliant with the blood and tissue legislation for any human donor-derived ingredients. For advanced therapies, so for cell and gene therapies, you need additional evidence for requirements around things like biological potency. So you need an assay for the release of the active substance in the finished product. You need to do viral safety evaluation, and you need to characterize and validate your cell banks. So any clinical trial material should be comparable to that which was used in your pivotal GLP studies. From a non-clinical perspective, in vitro, you need pharmacology data to demonstrate that the mode of action of the medicine is plausible. You also need your in vivo pharmacology using relevant animal models, or if it's not possible, you need justifications to why not. You need to conduct your safety pharmacology, particularly for respiratory, cardiac, and CNS systems. Genotoxicity and carcinogenicity studies are needed as well, but in some circumstances, those can be waived. And of course, you need your single dose and your repeat tox to support whatever dosing regimen you're using in the clinic. And your pivotal toxicity study needs to be GLP compliant. When it comes to human gene or cell therapies, you may need to develop an animal analog as well to generate the non-clinical data that you need. You can often defer reproductive tox studies. That's particularly for things like cancer therapies, and you may need to do juvenile tox studies if you intend pediatric clinical use. And I've provided links to the most useful guidance at the bottom of the slide for future reading. So before you start a trial, there are 2 things that you need. There are 2 approvals. So there's a clinical trial authorization from the competent authority, so the MHRA in the case of the UK. And what the competent authority does for the CTA is review whether the data you've got support the use of the investigational product at the dose you're intending, and the posology that you're intending in the population you're going to recruit in the study. You need to show that you've got a scientifically robust study designed to justify the exposure of human subjects to an investigational drug, and you need to show that what you're proposing is acceptably safe. You also need an opinion from an ethics committee, and they review the planned research for benefit risk, and they also look at protection of clinical trial participants and conformity with ethical standards. In terms of the dossier that you need to submit, the core dossier historically has varied from one country to another, but as an overview, these are the documents that you will need to draw together. In particular, the investigators brochure, the IMPD, and then the manufacturer's import, the manufacturer and importer's authorization, and the QP declaration are particularly important for the competent authority. And then for the ethics committee, the patient information and informed consent forms and any patient-facing documents are also particularly important when you come to file your ethics committee application. Needless to say, beyond just getting the authorization, there is a whole swathe of requirements that need to be met for you to run a clinical trial. I won't go through all of these, but clearly your clinical trial colleagues will need to be aware of these when they're running a clinical trial. You can, as a sponsor, transfer some of these duties and functions to other parties, so to a contract research organisation, but ultimately the sponsor retains overall responsibility for the quality and integrity of the trial, regardless of who's actually conducting the activities. So a lot is changing as well in the legislative space when it comes to clinical trial regulations. The Directive 2001/20 EC, which has been in place since 2004, is being repealed by the clinical trial regulation. So as of January next year, there will be a harmonised process for review of CTAs and ECs across the EU. So there'll be a single application which is evaluated across all member states and leads to a single decision, rather than the situation which existed before, where each member state reviewed a CTA or an ethics application individually, which was very labour intensive and could lead to divergent opinions. The CTR, the clinical trial regulation, will do away with that. So there'll be two parts to the assessment. So part one is a coordinated assessment of the CTA. This is where one of the countries where you intend to do your study, the reference member state or RMS, will do an initial evaluation which lasts 26 days, and then all the other countries where the study will take place, or the concerned member states or CMS, will review that evaluation and provide their view. The RMS then consolidates all of their feedback within 7 days, such that the whole process will lead to an approval in 45 days, or an additional 31 if questions have been raised that need to be addressed by the sponsor. The part two is the national evaluation of the ethics committee application. Similarly, that takes 45 days unless the sponsor is asked to respond to additional questions. And then the output of the procedure is a single decision through the EU portal, which is valid in all the member states where you want to conduct the study. Parts 1 and Part 2 can be extended, however, by 50 days if the clinical trial involves a cell or gene therapy. In the UK, there's also some changes which have come about to expedite setup of clinical trials. So as of the 1st of January next year, there will be only one way to submit in the UK for a clinical trial approval, through the IRAS, and this is a single application for both the CTA and ethics committee applications, and this has a review timeline of 42 to 60 days. There's also the potential for fast track ethics review as well, which is open to global clinical trials and phase 1 trials, either for an IMP for a study led from the UK with at least one other country participating, or from a study led from outside the UK, which could be placed in any country, and the UK is competing for participation. This applies to any phase 1 or phase 1/2 study in healthy volunteers or patients, but it doesn't include gene therapy medicinal products or studies that are funded by the US Department of Health and Human Services. The fast track ethics review aims to give an approval in half the time, so in 20 to 30 days. So I thought it might help if I drew all of this together into an illustration for how these component parts fit into the setup of a phase 1 study. So as I mentioned, for your non-clinical package, you need to set up your pharmacology. You need to demonstrate your pharmacology in animal models. You need to look at toxicology and viral shedding, if this is an example for a gene therapy in non-human primates. In parallel, your manufacturing process development will be ongoing. You'll be manufacturing your GMP batches and looking at your analytical comparability studies. As I said, it's well worth having a first draft of your target product profile available before you set up a clinical trial. You need to develop a regulatory justification for the non-clinical data package you're going to use to support, particularly first in human exposure. You need your clinical trial protocol, an investigator's brochure and an IMPD. And then, this being a gene therapy example, you could meet the EMA Innovation Task Force to discuss your development plan and get advice from them. You can do things like request an SME designation, which reduces your regulatory fees. You can go and take pre-CTA advice from the National Competent Authority who are going to review the application. And then you can also, you also need to prepare GMO risk assessments. And then when everything is gathered together, you submit your CTA, your GMO, and your ethics application. Once you start getting some clinical data, then you can start thinking about orphan applications and things like PRIME and ILAP. And I'll explain a bit more about what those are shortly. And I've provided some useful references in case you want to read around any of the subject matter further. So, accelerating development. So what are the regulatory incentives and expedited approval programs that could be available to you? So the first thing I want to talk about is PRIME. So this is a scheme which was launched by the EMA, and it's designed to provide enhanced support for the development of medicines that target an unmet medical need. And there are a number of benefits to this scheme. The first of which is the early appointment of the rapporteur from the CHMP. Now, the rapporteur is not normally appointed until 7 months before you submit your MAA. However, under this scheme, the rapporteur is appointed when you get access to the scheme, which can be actually very early in development. So this could be phase 1 or phase 2 clinical development. And what the rapporteur does is provide continuous support, and their involvement in PRIME helps them to build their knowledge of your development plan and your product ahead of an MAA filing. When the rapporteur has been appointed, you also have a kick-off meeting, which includes the rapporteur and then a multidisciplinary group of experts from the relevant EMA scientific committees and working parties. And that's particularly from PEDCO, COMP, PRAC, SORP, and CAT, which is the Pediatric, Orphan, Pharmacovigilance, Scientific Advice, and Advanced Therapies committees, respectively. You also get a dedicated contact person of the EMA who will coordinate the support that's offered to you through the scheme. And your rapporteur will help you design your scientific advice strategy for key development milestones. And there's the possibility to involve additional stakeholders along the way as well. So HTA bodies and patient representatives. One advantage of PRIME is that you get scientific advice at day 40 of the advice procedure rather than day 70, which can be quite helpful because you get your advice that bit sooner. And as part of PRIME, it's agreed that your product has the potential for accelerated assessment of the MAA, although that's something which has to be formally confirmed when you submit your MAA. So to be eligible for PRIME, you need to be developing a medicine which addresses an unmet need. And that's in the context of conditions for which there's either no satisfactory method of diagnosis, prevention, or treatment, or where your product could be of major therapeutic advantage to those affected. You need to have preliminary evidence of clinical efficacy. So typically that's clinical proof of concept. And the data that you provide in the application should support the claim that the product has the potential to bring a major therapeutic advantage to patients in a given indication. And that's either through a clinically meaningful improvement in efficacy or through improving the morbidity or mortality of the disease. Completing the application is not actually a big undertaking, and the review procedure is 40 days, and then the applicant is informed if they've been successful in getting a PRIME designation. The bar for acceptance is high, so 80% of applications are rejected. However, if you have SME designation, then your probability of success is higher. It's worth doing though, because if you get a PRIME designation, then it really speaks volumes around the potential benefit your product offers to patients, and it's a major endorsement of your development plan. So it really does increase the profile and asset value of your medicine if you get accepted. The good news is that applications are free as well, so there are no fees charged by the EMA for PRIME applications. The MHRA have also set up something called ILAP, the Innovative Licensing and Access Pathway, which is quite similar to PRIME. So again, this is for products which are for life-threatening or seriously debilitating conditions, or which have a significant patient or or for conditions which have a significant patient or public health need. And similarly to Prime, this is for medicinal products which are either innovative, such as a new chemical entity or an ATMP, or for medicines being developed for a clinically significant new indication, if it's a drug that's already licensed, or medicines for rare disease or other special populations, or it's for a product development which aligns with the objectives for UK public health priorities. Medicines that are accepted onto ILAP are those which have the potential to offer benefits to patients, either in terms of improved efficacy or safety, or through an or through a contribution to patient care. The interesting thing about ILAP is that it can actually be based on non-clinical data in valid models if you don't yet have clinical data, which is somewhat different to Prime, where you realistically need at least phase 1 clinical data to be accepted. And when you submit your ILAP application, you're encouraged to include the views of patients or patient organisations around the potential benefit of a product if you have those available. The interesting thing about ILAP is that the MHRA will help you define your target development profile. And this is analogous to the TPP. And this is something that defines the key regulatory and development features of the product, and also identifies potential pitfalls and lays out a roadmap for delivering early patient access. As part of this, you have a toolkit for potential support available to you. I've listed 3 here. There are actually several others. I won't go through all of them. Probably the one that's most interesting to this audience is the Rapid Clinical Trial Dossier Pre-Assessment. So this is where the MHRA will pre-review your dossier, your CTA dossier, and give you feedback with the intention of reducing the risks of a grounds for non-acceptance for when you file your CTA. So this is something that has real value because it means you can identify in advance any issues that you need to address outside of the timing constraints of the CTA evaluation.